Come with your unknowing. Come with your uncertainty. Come with your openness to mystery. Come seeking truth, seeking meaning, seeking justice. Come to the holiness of this hour. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Congregation of Westchester and our online service. I'm Reverend Dan Schatz, the minister, and I especially want to welcome any visitors to our service online this morning. We hope that we'll have the chance to get to know you. We hope someday we'll all meet in person. But in the meantime, you can say hello in the comments. You can go to ucwc.org or send us an email if you'd like more information about our congregation. We do have lots of things that happen that aren't on Sunday mornings, many of those through Zoom. And you can email us also if you'd like to be in touch more directly. Unitarian Universalism holds that great good comes from a wide diversity. So whoever you are, whoever you love, whatever your heritage, and from wherever your beliefs spring, we are pleased that you are here. Let us walk a while together. Now, normally we do a Zoom social hour after the service. This morning, we are going to be holding our congregation's annual meeting after the service via Zoom. So even if you're not a member, you're welcome to join us. We have upped our Zoom level so that we hope we can accommodate a larger crowd. But we do remind you that only congregation members can vote. And to be a member, you have to have signed a membership book and have stayed involved in contributing. So if you haven't signed the membership book, then you're not a member. Don't worry about it. Obviously, this is the first time that we have done something like this. And in case anybody's worried, we checked Pennsylvania law. It is completely valid and legal, but it is going to be different. Our board has worked very hard to make the annual meeting work, and we know that you will be patient with us even if some things don't go exactly as planned. There's no way to do a dry run of something like this, so it's going to be what it is in some ways. But they have done a lot of prep work for it. Also, this is going to be my last Sunday for a little while. I will be on leave for the next month or so, a little longer. So if you need me or if you need help from the discretionary fund, please reach out to me by Monday and Tuesday at the very latest. This is especially if you think that you're going to be needing assistance. I am available for emergencies most of the time that I'm away, but I will not be as easy to get a hold of. We also have a summer religious education program, and I think the kids met for the first time today. It's a UU Principles scavenger hunt. That'll be pre-K through middle school grades, and we are working on a program for teens. So for more information on any of that, contact Sarah Heisen, and you simply write to re@ucwc.org. And remember to keep reading Connections and the website for other announcements and upcoming events. We enter into worship with the lighting of the chalice. We light this chalice as a reminder that inside all of us shines a questing spirit, illumining the world with sacred curiosity. Today's service is our annual Ask the Minister service, and this year, in the end, I got many questions. I wasn't sure I would, but they always come through in the end, including some on biblical history that had me turning to this theological library you see around me more than once. And in case you think I'm being flip about that, just two questions caused me to look up this book and this book, and this one, this one, and volumes 2 and 5 of this one. But there is one question. There's one question that I imagine this year and this spring and this summer we're all asking in some way. And it is the question both asked and answered in our opening hymn, Where is Our Holy Church? And I invite you to join me in the words of our unison affirmation. We gather aspiring to be a thriving, caring, and welcoming community that supports each person's spiritual journey, embraces diversity, challenges us to live responsibly, and is a catalyst for a just and compassionate world. Well, our congregation depends on the generosity of our members. It is a little tough when we're online. It's just there's something about passing the plate that can not only connects us, but also encourages people to maybe put something in the plate. And when we're on YouTube, it isn't as easy, but we have set it up so that you can donate. You can donate on the web, or you can donate by text, or you can donate by app. Instructions on those will come up in a few minutes. And I hope that if you're able, you will consider using those services or send a check or maybe just add something into what you pay for a pledge each month. Think about how much you would be putting in the plate because that is income that our congregation depends on to do everything we're doing as well. And I thank you for your generosity. We will now receive our morning offering. for these gifts and for everything we give in every way to our many communities. We are truly grateful. Well, as I mentioned, we had some big questions this year, some of which were academic, theological, even folkloric. So there's a lot here. I'm going to dive right in. First question, can you explain the concept and history of purgatory? I've recently heard it referred to in both Catholic and Jewish beliefs and don't know how it fits into their beliefs about death. So, well, this is one that doesn't come up too often in UU circles, but there is a UU connection. I don't profess expertise. I had to go to some of my books. But the word purgatory comes from the Latin purgatorius, to cleanse. Purgatory is the means of cleansing. So the first idea of purgatory appeared in Judaism in later biblical times in some of the prophetic writings. There was an idea of a place of fiery purification where the dead would pass through. In Christianity, that idea eventually morphed into hell. But hell is problematic, as we Universalists know. So purgatory started to make a comeback, especially in the Roman Catholic Church. The official view of the Catholic Church is that purgatory is for all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. Now, there are different ideas of what purgatory might be like. Catholic writers differ on whether purgatory is a place or a state of being. And of course, the most famous depiction of purgatory was Dante's Purgatorio, which envisioned a mountain with 7 terraces representing the 7 deadly sins, through each of which one had to pass, and the Garden of Eden at the top, from which one could ascend to heaven. Dante was vivid. Now, purgatory was also important for early Universalists, many of whom argued that those who sinned in life would go through a period of purification before being restored to grace and to heaven. So the Universalist Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia was named after that belief. But as time went on, more and more Universalists taught that there was no such thing as hell or purgatory at all, even for limited times, that God's grace was absolute and universal, and that all people would immediately go to heaven when they died. And that vision of a God who is all-loving rather than punishing became the cornerstone of Universalism for many, many years. Second question. My question revolves around angels, specifically guardian angels. Do they exist? As an agnostic, I find it strangely comforting to think of angels or protective spirits watching over me in times of difficulty. I can call on them and they will come. I find the concept of angels intriguing. How long has that image of a winged human being been around? At the time the Bible was written, how did they think about angels? So from the earliest writings in the Hebrew Bible and on through the Christian scriptures, there have been supernatural beings other than God. And we tend to lump those all together using the word angels, but there are different words for them scattered throughout the scriptures, and their form and function has changed over time. So in Genesis, there's a line that says that as the people began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God thought that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them for wives, which is a way more earthy take on angels than most of us are used to or probably want to hear. Later scriptures envisioned God as a king in heaven attended by angels. And then by the time you get to Revelation, angels have become more like guardians for people or for places. And all of that reflects the interaction of biblical religion with the culture and beliefs of the time. And all of these beings are described, again, with different words in the original texts. Now, do angels exist? I tend to think that's a lot like asking, does God exist? If you think about it very long, it gets into questions like, well, what exactly do we mean when we say God? So I would ask the same question about angels. What do we mean by angels? And for that matter, what do we mean by belief? Is a belief in angels a literal belief? Or could angels be a metaphor for parts of our own spirit, a way of connecting with the holiness and the wholeness of the universe? In Hinduism, there are famously millions of gods, but each of those gods, in all their distinctiveness, is an aspect of Brahman, the totality of everything, as we are. We are also aspects of Brahman. You could think of angels the same way. It's all part of our universe, and what we call it is simply our particular window to the holy. Sometimes the living spiritual reality is too big to connect with as a whole, and it helps us to give some piece of that whole form and shape and maybe even a name. That could be angels. Now, in every Ask the Minister service, there's one question that comes with footnotes. This is the question. There's a parable about the householder who went to hire laborers for his vineyard for 1 denarius a day. In his book, The Politics of Jesus, Reverend Aubrey Hendricks, footnote, says that most biblical commentators believe that this parable was Jesus' teaching that God's grace is equally available to all. The following synopsis is directly from Hendricks' book. He says that it is not simply a story of divine benevolence, it is fraught with the horrors of economic violence, depicting an arbitrary and capricious landowner and humiliated, exploited workers desperate for work. There was high unemployment, as shown in verse 3, and the workers had no choice but to accept the landowner's terms. So Reverend Hendricks says that this parable is less about extolling the benevolence of God's grace than decrying economic violence and exploitation. Reverend Hendricks relates the landowner to a plantation master who is exploiting the workers with an offer of 1 denarius. That is not a living wage during the time of Roman rule, but the workers have no choice. The usual interpretation is that the owner is giving an egalitarian gesture to all the workers. That is, the people who came in at the end of the day are receiving the same pay as the people who came at the beginning. That's the parable. However, Hendricks points out that the landowner does not make a similar gesture with his own wealth. So my question is there a UU interpretation of this passage? I have to say that Reverend Hendricks portrays Jesus as quite a revolutionary, contrary to the tame Jesus loves the little children portrayed in mainstream and evangelical churches. He proposes that the messages of Jesus were tamed by usurpation by Roman government and culture. Does UU theology have any stand on this? Well, that's the question. One of the beauties of Unitarian Universalist theology is that it rarely limits us to a single interpretation of anything. Everyone who reads the Bible or anything else brings their own perspective to the text. If we want to get at the original meaning of a scriptural passage, then we have to look at context. So this passage appears in Matthew, but it doesn't appear in Mark or Luke or Q, the Sayings Gospel. In biblical studies, we call that the special M source. So this is special M. Matthew tends to have a more spiritual spin on everything, where it's Luke that takes up the social justice themes. Given when the scriptures were put together, I don't think it has much to do with the Roman authorities, but rather represents a sort of rabbinical midrash or commentary on the stories. So Matthew is interested, again, in spiritual well-being. Luke is more grounded in oppression and the human condition. So where Luke says, "Blessed are the poor," Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Right? Luke says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst," while Matthew says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." So all of this tells me that this particular parable probably wasn't intended to have a social justice meaning, at least not for the author of Matthew, because that would be inconsistent with what's going on in Matthew. And we don't have any other source for it. And because it appears only in Matthew, I'd say it's doubtful whether Jesus ever told this story at all. That said, the parable has been used by some liberation theologians as support for social programs and a minimum living wage. And that's a good modern interpretation, but given that it's Matthew and not Luke, I'm not thinking that was the original meaning. And when you read the Bible, you have to consider the time in which it was written. There are examples of injustice which are repeated throughout. Some of those passages have been held up to justify abuse. Some of those passages have been held up to justify slavery. I think we make a mistake when we begin with an assumption that just because something is in the Bible, it must be good. The existence of economic injustice, patriarchy, and slavery in the Bible reflects the existence of economic injustice, patriarchy, and slavery at the time that Jesus lived. One of the valuable aspects of Scripture, though, is that we can read it on many levels, some of which are very modern. It's just important that we not mistake our interpretation of a passage for the original interpretation. And now a question which is a little less esoteric, but no less deep. Do you use have soul, excuse me, do you use have us, start again. Do you use have souls and how can you tell? If it had been, do you use have soul and how can you tell? That would have been a very different question. Do you use have souls? There's a story that was told once by the former UUA president, Louis Cornish, about a conversation he had with a very young girl. He pointed to her nose and he said, "Is this you?" She said, "No." And then he pointed to her knee and he said, "Is this you?" She said, "No." He pointed to her elbow. "Is this you?" "No." And then she said, "I don't think you know what Claire is." And then she told him, "Claire is what looks at you out of my eyes." So when I say soul, that's what I mean. My soul is what looks at you out of my eyes. It is who I am. In Greek, the word for soul is psyche, and it is very much the same thing. It is that of us which in some way is more than the sum of our parts. Some people believe that souls are separate from our bodies, that they're in some way immortal. That's not my theology. But I do believe this. When we live, we influence and change the people in the world around us. A part of us becomes part of others, and that is the only immortality my soul desires. Our next group of questions, I said in the order of service that they're about ministry and ethics. It was more of a random hodgepodge. And the first is, what are some of the Universalist views on how to deal with people and evil deeds since we are all saved? So I interpreted this as more of the historic Universalist. There's a famous story about Hosea Balu, the Universalist preacher. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. Most of you will hear me tell it again. A father came to Reverend Balu afraid for his son who had been carousing, drinking, generally going down an unfortunate path in life. "And I'm afraid," said the man, "that my son is going to hell. What should I do?" Balu told him he should build a great big bonfire in the middle of the road. And when his son came around the corner, pick his son up and throw him in the bonfire and burn him. The man said, "I can't do that. I love my son." Balu said, "If you, an imperfect human father, love your son too much to do that, how could God, the perfect Father, love him any less?" Universalism holds that you don't need the threat of hell to get people to live good lives, and that the punishment for doing evil is your own misery in life. Things like cruelty and inhumanity corrupt the human spirit and are ultimately unsatisfying. And I believe that. I look at some folks in the world that are doing some terrible things, and I say, you know, as bad as it is to be the victim of what they are doing, I sure would not want to be them. What broken, sad individuals they are. Today, when we talk about the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, we are expressing universalism in its purest form. So the universalist approach to one who is doing wrong is to help them find their deeper, more authentic self. It doesn't work every time for every person. We know this. But we also know that the threat of hell doesn't work any better, and I would guess is probably considerably less effective than looking for the good in someone and trying to reach that. This was a very specific question. At work this winter, the company provided Chinese food as a surprise free lunch for the staff. Apparently, some people complained to management that they didn't want Chinese food, and others complained that they already had other food. Our vice president lamented, "Why do people not like things?" She was shocked that people would complain about literally a free lunch. I suppose the question is really, why can people find discontent in a gift that at worst does no harm whatsoever? It's hard to answer that question in the general sense. The phrase "people's is people's" comes to mind. Full disclosure, I sometimes get headaches from MSG, which a lot of Chinese restaurants add to their food. So even though I love Chinese food, I actually, when I read this, felt a little sympathy with the grumblers. Yay, there's a free lunch. Bummer, I can't eat it. I might have felt left out. But if I already had my lunch, at least I wouldn't be hungry. As to why people can find discontent in a harmless gift, I don't know. Maybe they felt left out. Or maybe they were just in a mood. Maybe it was related to the prejudice against Chinese people that was floating around with the epidemic news this winter, in which case your workplace needs to do some training around racism and intolerance. So what's a better way to respond if we are discontented with a free lunch? If there is an issue of inclusion, we can gently bring that up with the giver and do some education. I know you were doing a generous and wonderful thing, but I just want you to be aware that there's an ingredient many Chinese restaurants use that causes reactions in some people, so it's helpful to check and see if they can make the food without it. I've actually done that. I really appreciate your generosity, but if we want to include everyone, we should try to have vegan and gluten-free options. Can I help you next time that you'd like to do something like this? And again, even if we're not happy, we can appreciate the good intention. Here's a question about ministry and about studying for ministry. I am curious about what seminary is like for a UU student wannabe minister. I'm guessing, although I don't know, that much of seminary revolves at its core around Christianity. Is that difficult to navigate? Are there a lot of classes which are more general in nature? I'm guessing world religions, of course, but also things like how to minister, or sermon writing, or community connections and support, etc. I'm just curious what kind of classes there are overall and how challenging it might be for a person of UU spirit to navigate what I can imagine is a very God-centered program. Well, I went to seminary at Harvard Divinity School, which at that time had more Unitarian Universalist students than any other denomination, and I'm pretty sure had more UU students even than the UU seminaries did. And the Divinity School is historically Unitarian Universalist. We were founded by Unitarians over 200 years ago, and Harvard Divinity School has always been one of the primary places for people to study for our ministry. I want to clarify, it's not that Harvard was founded by Unitarians, but the Divinity School, when they started, they didn't have to call themselves a Unitarian seminary because it was just assumed every professor and every student was a Unitarian. My first class at Harvard was on Unitarian Universalist religious education. Later that year, I studied ministry through preaching, taught by 2 UU ministers. So it was a comfortable place to be. It does require courses listed under the heading Christianity and Culture, which was a little jarring, but those included all the theology and ethics courses, some of which were very broad. Harvard also requires courses on world religions, and many of my classmates, especially those who were studying for non-ministry degrees, were part of the Center for the Study of World Religions. So in Divinity Hall, which at that time was one of the dorms for Harvard Divinity School, I lived for 2 years with Buddhists and with Native Americans, Pentecostals, UUs, Presbyterians, Catholics, Hindus, Muslims, Confucianists, Jews, and atheists, and I loved that diversity. It is true that as a humanist, I sometimes found some of the assumptions that some of my Christian colleagues made a little frustrating. One of them once told me, it's a Christian seminary and it was nice of them to let you come, but it's not like this is for you. And so I gave that person a little history lesson. I also sometimes would get frustrated, as I mentioned earlier, at the lengths some of my colleagues would go to save the text in biblical classes, when it was pretty clear to me that the original meaning of something was pretty patriarchal. I felt the freedom to say out loud that I thought sometimes the Bible was wrong. So when I was in seminary, I was able to study everything from contemporary American theology to cross-cultural Buddhist conceptions of nature to the ethics of relationships, as well as nuts and bolts courses like pastoral care and hymnody. What unfortunately I never had the opportunity to take was the course on ministry during a simultaneous global pandemic, economic crisis, period of civil unrest, and existential threat to constitutional democracy. Kind of wish I'd gotten that one. Well, our next set of questions deals with social justice and racism. And as we move into those questions, I want to share with you a song that I wrote several years ago, just after Michael Brown was killed, when things were happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's a song that I had hoped but not expected would go out of date. It's a song for Black lives. One of the verses of this song names several unarmed black people who died at the hands of police officers. And I keep changing that verse because there are so many more new names and so many names that I could add if only there were space. I have hope today that in some places, some things are beginning to shift. And I know that our work together for Black lives is making a difference. But this song remains, especially after the news of last night in Atlanta, entirely too relevant. He was another young man, cut down in his prime. He wasn't going anywhere, he wasn't doing any crime, but his skin was black, he didn't wait to see. He never had a gun, they shot him dead in the street. Put on your walking shoes, join in and march for change. These walls we've erected will surely come down, and love will win again. She was a black woman driving through the wrong part of town. He pulled her over and he dragged her out. He said, I'll light you up, hauled her away. They threw her into prison. She was dead in 3 days. Put on your walking shoes. Join in and march for change. These walls we've erected will surely come down, and love will win again. We are citizens together, we are clergy, police. We're from every religion and from every race. We've seen too many die, their lives too cheap. Justice and equality are promises to keep. Put on your walking shoes. Join in and march for change. These walls we've erected will surely come down, and love will win again. From Ferguson, Missouri to the streets of LA, for Trayvon Martin and for Freddie Gray, for Tamir, Breonna, George Floyd and Michael Brown, we say that Black Lives Matter, we will not be shut down. Put on your walking shoes. Join in and march for change. These walls we've erected will surely come down, and love will win. Put on your walking shoes. Join in and march for change. These walls we've erected will surely come down, and love will win again. Which brings us into our questions on racism and justice making. Is there a historical view of race relations that was and is based on religious belief or practice? Did African American or white religious practices in times of slavery contribute to white supremacy development? I would say rather that religious belief and practice is based on views of race instead of the other way around. Many white people look to the Bible to justify and uphold slavery. They gave slave ships religious names. They preached that Africans were sons of Ham, descendants of a cursed tribe from the book of Genesis. But that idea never existed until Europeans began to colonize Africa. First came racism, then came the religious justification. And there are some who continue to use religion in support of white supremacy. How they can do this when there are literally no white people in the Bible eludes me, but sometimes and somehow they manage. Christianity was forced on enslaved people. It was a means of social control. They would be subjected to sermons emphasizing biblical passages like Ephesians, slaves, obey your masters. They were told that good slaves would be rewarded in heaven after they died. There were even slave Bibles made to reinforce these messages with anything that hinted at liberation, including the entire story of the Exodus, removed. First came the racism. Then came the religious justification. Now, any person or any group who is being oppressed has to find a balance between resistance to that oppression and accommodation. You have to accommodate some in order to survive, but you have to resist to overcome the oppression and to keep your heart and spirit from breaking. What enslaved people did was find all of those parts of the Bible their oppressors didn't want them to see. They looked to the Exodus from Egypt. They looked to the prophets. They looked to a Jesus who taught that the lowest in society was as important as the highest. They accommodated their oppression by accepting Christianity, but they resisted by finding those aspects of Christianity that taught liberation. And then they took it a step further by using religion as a code in their own search for freedom. There is a reason Harriet Tubman was known as Moses. And because they were allowed to sing hymns, they created the spirituals as signals. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Or Moses, Moses, don't let Pharaoh take you. Moses, Moses, don't let Pharaoh take you. Moses, Moses, don't let Pharaoh take you in some lonesome graveyard. And the slaves would know it was time to leave. What can we do this year to make Black Lives Matter in our local community? Vote on November 3rd as a given. Well, that's a question that contains the seed of the answer. That seed is local. We tend to think of change as something that happens on a national or historic scale, but our own communities are where we can have the most influence if we choose to exercise it. If we want our towns to redirect some of the money they have put into policing to better ways of meeting the needs of the community, we need to advocate for it, because that kind of change is hard, and it's a whole lot simpler for a whole lot of people to just live with the status quo. It isn't better, but it is easier. We also need to advocate for police accountability and educational equality. We need to advocate on the state level for policies that take privilege into account and don't simply direct the most money into the areas with the most privilege. Many people want to make these kinds of changes, but it is the nature of government that they will not happen without dedicated advocacy. Aside from all of this, I believe that those of us who are white need to learn to listen. I said this last week. Part of privilege is not having to pay attention to the realities of white supremacy in our culture. I could get along perfectly well without ever noticing the fact that I am not afraid for my life when I get pulled over for speeding. I can walk through any neighborhood without worrying that somebody's going to see me as a threat. I've had an easy time finding jobs as a UU religious professional. And I'm used to being able to speak my mind without being dismissed or accused or ignored. Many of our black and brown kin cannot say the same. That means, as hard as it is for somebody like me, sometimes I need to shut my mouth and let other people lead. It means using my privilege to amplify the voices of those who do not have such privilege. So those are some things that we can do. And you mentioned voting. We can help others vote as well. And finally, we can answer the call when we're asked. We can show up. Maybe that doesn't happen in person in these epidemic days. Maybe it happens through letters and phone calls or other ways. But just because we are at home does not mean we have license to hide from this struggle. This is one of the great moral issues of our day, and we need to engage. Another question, and the last in this set. Maybe it's too easy to focus on the negatives and miss the good news, but all too often I feel that social justice work is very much one step forward and two steps backwards. I feel this within our denomination when we're dealing with institutional racism and LGBTQ non-inclusivity, and I feel it often in the wider world where it feels like humanity not only has to solve new and interesting sociological problems, but also has the joy of repeating the same mistakes over and over again. I get that for good self-care, I need to step back, catch my breath, re-energize, and then march forward. But it's damn hard to keep my eyes on the prize. So, fair questioner, is there a question to be asked of the minister among all these statements? Okay, sure. Are we making measurable progress? How do we keep moving forward? And more importantly, as religious leaders, how do we find the strength not only to carry on, but to inspire those who follow us? There, 2 questions, bonus. Well, there is a popular meme on the internet that is a cartoon with a professor in their study, and it says, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. Sometimes it feels that way. When we look at reports from various commissions formed in the wake of racial strife going back 100 years, we see the same recommendations again and again, ignored again and again. There is a reason that many of my friends of color, when faced with ignorance or indifference or denial from white people, use the term exhausting. The Unitarian minister Theodore Parker taught, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King repeated, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. Sometimes we have to take a step back and look at the long term. I know it feels like it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I think it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Right now we live in a reactionary time, but look at how the reactionaries defend themselves. They will bend over backward to say, I'm not a racist. I'm not a homophobe. I'm not transphobic. And maybe we can question whether they're being honest about that or whether they're being manipulative about that. But the fact remains that it is not socially acceptable to be racist, to be homophobic, to be transphobic. That is a significant change. That's a good change. It wasn't that way when I was growing up and Jesse Helms was in the Senate. Yes, we face many of the same struggles, but we are a little further along than we were before. There is an understanding that is growing today that racism is systemic as well as personal. I think what feels like the step back sometimes is that we've come to realize that even in 2020, sometimes it is personal. And sometimes that happens among people that don't think of themselves as racist. So take courage. We're not losing. Even when it feels like we are not losing. And if we stay true to our values, I don't believe that we will lose. That doesn't mean we'll win every time. It doesn't mean we'll win on every issue. But it does mean that the arc will bend towards justice. Now, there is a danger. And that danger is that we allow our justified outrage to overcome our core values. If we begin dismissing the humanity of people who disagree with us, then we are working against our cause. I've seen social media posts expressing the hope that people who think COVID-19 is a hoax will get sick and die. That doesn't help anybody. It's immoral and it's contrary to the basic essence of Unitarian Universalism. So be encouraged, but also be true to UU values. We are Universalists. We do not shrink from controversy, but neither do we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of dismissing anyone's humanity. No, not even that person you're probably thinking of right now. If we can remember who we are, we will retain the moral high ground, and our words and actions will be all the more powerful. one of the songs that helps ground me in my Unitarian Universalist ideals is Meditation on Breathing by Sarah Dan Jones. As we move into the time in our service when we lift up our joys and our sorrows, I invite you to sing, "When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love."
When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love.
We didn't get any emails for Joys and Sorrows this week, but I want to light a few candles anyway. I would like to light a candle in gratitude for all that went into a memorial service last week and the way that this congregation was able to minister to a family in the most difficult of times, despite our social distance. And I light a candle for all who are grieving during this time. A candle for all who have found reasons for celebration. And a final candle, as always, for all of those joys and all of those sorrows which remain unspoken. Please sing, "When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love."
When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love.
I invite you to join me for a few moments in the mystery of quietness. open yourself to the questions. Who am I called to be? How will I live? What is my responsibility to humanity, to myself, to life? Open yourself to the where and open yourself to the why. Ask with mind blazing and a heart that beats with compassion, seeking always yes. I invite you, wherever you are, to sing, just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life.
Just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life. Though with pain I made my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Just as long as vision lasts, I must answer yes to truth. In my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to truth. Just as long as my heart beats, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. If they ask what I did best, tell them I said yes to love.
We have one last question. And after that question, we'll have our postlude and we will all go and join our annual meeting on Zoom. Please do, if you're a member, make sure that you join us. It's an important one. The question is, how do we fix this thing? We fix this thing with love. We fix this thing with deep, fierce, and compassionate love. We fix this with the kind of love that overrides our need to be comfortable. We fix this with the kind of love that lifts others and inspires everyone to the love within their own souls. We fix this thing with love. Now go and do likewise, and go in peace.